I'm Celene Ibrahim. I'm the author of Women and Gender in the Qur'an that came out from Oxford University Press in 2020. So when I first started to pull material together about women figures in the Qur'an, I started noticing that the stories that I might have picked up in just Muslim community events and the like didn't necessarily always capture the depth, or even were not entirely accurate as to what the Qur'an actually depicted. And so I wanted to write a book that was very focused on the actual terminology that the Qur'an uses, the actual depictions of women, rather than maybe some interpolations that come from later texts or that come from cultural ideas about women. And so on the one hand, the work wanted to make an intervention into the ways we talk about women in the Qur'an and in Muslim settings. And the other intervention I hoped to make with the book was one in the field of Quranic studies, which I wanted to write a book that was academic and that relied on academic sources and methodologies that come out of Quranic studies in the secular academy, but that was able to also honor the discourse and the ways of approaching the Quran that are endemic to Muslims. So I wanted to see if I could make a book that could simultaneously speak on a deep level to academics and to ordinary practicing Muslims. And part of the impulse to do that was to decolonize a bit the field of Quranic studies, which has for decades really treated the Quran not necessarily as a recitation that has profound spiritual sacred meaning for people. So it was oftentimes in Quranic studies that the aspect of an experience of the Quran, affective engagement with the Quran, was missing. And so I just play in the book with this idea of what the stories do to us as listeners or as readers, as people who are engaging with the Quran. So the book is a thematic treatment of women, gender, sexuality, as is presented in Quranic stories. Now, there's so many verses that have to do with women figures in the Quran. My account was about 300 of them. And so I decided on a topical analysis because that allowed themes to emerge from verses that are in very different surahs. I could pull them together. And this thematic approach allowed me to start with biological difference and sexuality. And so I tried to build it out from gender, biological, the male-femaleness, to gender as a social construct. And the last chapter ends with women's political contributions and political roles, looks a little bit more at legal theory and law as it emerges from the Quran. And so we see the book moves in a way from embodied female person to intimate relationships. The second chapter is on kinship relationships. And so after that, it's looking at women's speech and comparing female speech in the Quran in ways to male speech, although there remains much more to be done in that area. And then the last chapter, as I mentioned, is more thinking about female social roles. And I was emphasizing in that chapter the ways in which women are oftentimes the impetus for new women. Quranic women are used in later Medinan surahs as a way to establish new law, that their stories then become a precedent for the community to come. So the early Meccan surahs tend to be more focused on biblical women. And then as we move through the Tanzili, this revelatory order, we could say, then we find that at the end, particularly, we find more women of the Arabian community are then mentioned or alluded to through asbab an-nuzul, reasons of revelation. So I trace basically I traced the unfolding of the Quranic as a revealed scripture. I trace that order and ask where and when in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where do stories in the Quran that involve women relate to events on the ground in the unfolding Muslim community. I also, in certain segments of the book, read the Qur'an as a mushaf, as a from Surah Al-Fatiha to Surah Nas, asking, okay, how in the structure of the Qur'an and in the way surahs are laid out, where do we find stories of women, and what can this tell us about subtle meanings in the Qur'an? And then I look at the so we have the order of the Qur'an, like as it's the final compiled order. We have the order of the revelation, and then the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how that interacts with the stories that are being told. So I try to, and I do that all in thematic segments. So it's not a book where people can go to find all the verses on Maryam in one section, right? It's not organized by personality. It's organized in a way to help us think as Muslims about how our Qur'an presents big topical ideas. I'm working on several projects all at once, as is very typical for an academic, but the one that relates most closely to this particular project is one that I'm tentatively calling Men and Gender in the Qur'an. Very little research has been done to date in masculinity studies as it relates to the Qur'an. There are a few people who are working in that domain, people looking at prophetic speech, and some people looking at the expressions of masculinity in the Qur'an, but it hasn't been done very systematically yet. And so that's one project that I'm working on. It might take a while still, but I'm also working on projects that are looking at some of the Quranic figures in asking with regard to the asbab and nuzul. I'm trying to understand this link between when something that is related in the Qur'an, when does it derive law, and in relation to the stories that involve women, and when is a story simply a moral account of something that transpired, and it doesn't create a principle that we then create fiqh out of. And I'm really trying to understand this dynamic, situated as I am as a Quranic scholar, right? And interested in issues of women and gender. So we have a fiqh system that has particular rules pertaining to women, but have we sufficiently understood the stories of the Qur'an and the ways in which that can also influence our shared morality, our expression of what we see as permissible or forbidden, or desirable or undesirable?